The story revolves around a man, Daniel, who discovers his wife Hannah's long-standing infidelity, leading to a deep unraveling of his personal and professional life. The plot begins when Daniel finds a contraceptive pill backing in their home, despite having had a vasectomy. Suspicious, he investigates further, employing surveillance equipment, cloning his wife's phone, and conducting DNA tests. The results confirm his worst fears. Both children he raised are not biologically his, and Hannah has been having an affair with her boss, Marcus, for years. Daniel devises a calculated response, focusing on securing his assets and planning a divorce. Supported by his assistant Claire and a strong legal team, he not only protects his company but also exposes Hannah's actions publicly. His revenge includes ensuring minimal financial gains for Hannah and confronting the emotional betrayal. The climax involves unexpected turns, such as Marcus being killed by his wife, Evelyn, upon discovering his ongoing affair with Hannah. The story concludes with Daniel moving on, finding closure, and beginning a new chapter with Claire, who had secretly admired him for years. It's a tale of betrayal, calculated revenge, and eventual redemption, filled with emotional complexity and strategic maneuvering. The next few days were a blur. My mind spun with questions. How long had this been going on? Did she even love me anymore? Was any part of our life real? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I knew one thing. I couldn't confront her without solid evidence. Hannah was charming, quick on her feet, and if I went in with just suspicions, she'd likely flip the narrative. I needed to be certain. So, I got to work. First, I cloned her phone. I'd read about apps that could mirror someone's messages, calls, and photos in real time. It felt invasive, wrong, even, but I told myself I had no choice. I installed the app while she was showering and set it to sync with my own phone. Next, I bought a small surveillance camera online. Nothing flashy, just something discreet enough to hide in the living room where she often took her work calls. I placed it behind a family photo on the shelf. It was subtle, unnoticeable. Hannah never paid attention to the cluttered decor anyway. While I waited for the camera to record something useful, I dug into her phone records. Calls to Marcus were frequent, often late at night. She'd saved his number under a woman's name, Martha, but the texts I'd already read exposed that thin cover. 2 days later, the camera gave me my first hard evidence. I was at work when my phone buzzed. The app had flagged activity, and I opened the feed to see Hannah lounging on the couch, laughing as she spoke into her phone. Her voice was low and playful, a tone she hadn't used with me in years. "Stop it, Marcus," she giggled. "You're going to get me in trouble." I gripped my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. My vision blurred with rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. I recorded the clip, saving it as Exhibit A. That night, I didn't mention anything. We sat through dinner like everything was normal. The kids were their usual lively selves, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Hannah chatted about her day, smiling and laughing, and for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself it wasn't true. But then I'd remember her voice on that call, the way she sounded so alive, and it wasn't for me. The breaking point came a week later. I found something I couldn't ignore, an email. It was hidden in a folder she probably thought I'd never check. Marcus had written it a few months ago, during a work trip she'd taken to Chicago. "Marcus, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Let's make these trips a regular thing. Just you and me, away from everything." Her reply was even worse. "Hannah, you make me feel like a woman again. I don't know what I'd do without you." That was it. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. I'd read enough. I wanted to scream, to break something, to confront her right then and there. But instead, I closed the laptop and walked outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm the fire raging inside. I couldn't just blow up. Not yet. I needed to think strategically. That night, I called Claire. "Daniel, it's late. Everything okay?" she asked, concern laced in her voice. "Claire," I began, my voice trembling. "I need your help. It's about Hannah." Claire didn't interrupt as I laid everything out. The pill packet, the texts, the surveillance footage. By the time I finished, there was silence on the other end. "I don't even know what to say," she finally said, her voice heavy. "That's awful. I'm so sorry, Daniel. What do you want to do?" "I want to protect what's mine," I said, my voice hardening. "The house, my company, everything. If she's willing to throw away our family, she doesn't get to take me down with her." Claire hesitated. "Okay. First, you need a lawyer. A good one. And second, you might not like hearing this, but you need a paternity test for the kids." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. "What?" Daniel, if she's been unfaithful, you need to know the truth. It's better to find out now than later. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind, and now it consumed me. The kids, my kids, were my world. I loved them more than anything. The idea that they might not be mine made me feel physically sick. But Claire was right. If I was going to do this, I had to know everything. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Okay, I'll do it. Over the next week, I worked in silence. I contacted a lawyer, started moving assets around discreetly, and ordered DNA tests for the kids. Each step felt like a betrayal, but I reminded myself that the real betrayal wasn't mine. It was hers. The DNA results arrived faster than I expected. I opened the envelope alone in my office, my hands trembling. The first result hit me like a freight train. Child 1. Probability of paternity, 0%. I blinked, reread it, and then moved to the next page. Child 2. Probability of paternity, 0%. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in. The kids I'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, they weren't mine. I sat there for hours, staring at the papers. Eventually, the tears came. Not angry tears, but the kind you cry when you've lost something you can never get back. When I finally stood up, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. She had stolen years of my life, my trust, my family. The next step was clear. It was time to confront Hannah. But this wouldn't be a screaming match or a dramatic showdown. No, I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the pain she had inflicted. I waited for the right moment to confront her. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted everything to be perfect, controlled. After all, she had been calculating enough to hide her affair for years. She had lied to my face, stolen my trust, and pretended everything was fine. This wasn't going to be a spur-of-the-moment argument. It was a Sunday night, and the kids were asleep. Hannah was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone and sipping tea. I walked in and stood across from her, hands in my pockets. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. She looked up, surprised. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled the pill backing from my pocket and placed it on the table between us. Her expression didn't change at first, but I saw the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. "What's this doing in our house?" I asked. Her smile was rehearsed, her tone dismissive. "Oh, that. It's old. Probably from years ago. I must have forgotten to throw it away." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Don't lie to me, Hannah." The smile faded, replaced by a defensive scowl. "What's with the tone, Daniel? You're making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing," I snapped, my voice rising. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. With a few swipes, I opened the video from the hidden camera and placed it on the table. Her face went pale as the recording played. There she was, laughing on the couch, flirting with Marcus. "Hannah, stop it, Marcus," she giggled in the video. "You're going to get me in trouble." The kitchen was silent except for the faint sound of her own voice echoing from the phone. She reached for it, but I snatched it away. "Explain that," I demanded. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she shook her head. "That's out of context, Daniel. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I shot back. "I understand you've been lying to me for years. I understand you've been sneaking around with Marcus. And I understand that you've made a fool out of me." Her eyes filled with tears. An act, I thought bitterly. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Marcus and I are just friends. That's all." I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Friends? That's the best you've got? Friends don't write emails about incredible nights or call each other dozens of times a day. Friends don't sneak off to hotel rooms and sleep together." Her face twisted with anger. "You've been spying on me? Snooping through my phone, recording me? That's disgusting, Daniel. You're violating my privacy." "Your privacy?" I barked. "Are you serious right now? You're standing here, lying through your teeth, and you want to lecture me about privacy." She crossed her arms, her tears gone as quickly as they had come. "You're paranoid. Marcus and I work together closely, sometimes too closely, maybe, but it's never crossed the line. If you're so insecure, maybe that's something you need to work on." I pulled out the DNA test results and slapped them on the table. "Then explain this." Her eyes darted to the papers, and for the first time, I saw real panic. She didn't reach for them, didn't try to read them. She just stared at them like they might bite. "What is that?" she whispered. "The truth," I said coldly. "Both kids. Neither of them is mine." Her breath hitched, and she stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter. "Daniel, I can explain." "Explain what, Hannah? That you've been sleeping with Marcus for years? That you've been lying to me, to the kids, to everyone? That you let me believe they were mine while you carried on with your boss?" She started to cry, her sobs loud and ugly. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of hand. I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't." "How long, Hannah?" I asked, my voice like ice. She didn't answer. "How long?" She wiped her face, trembling. 6 years. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. 6 years. Longer than my vasectomy. Longer than I'd even suspected. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this to me?" Her answer came in a rush of words, a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "You were always so busy with work. You stopped paying attention to me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Marcus made me feel alive." I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "So this is my fault?" She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. "No, I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." I stepped back, suddenly calm. "You didn't just hurt me, Hannah. You destroyed me. You destroyed our family." For a long moment, we stood there, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the kitchen. That night, I slept in the guest room. The house felt different, colder, emptier. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The morning after I confronted Hannah, the house felt like a ghost of itself. She moved around quietly, like a shadow avoiding the light. She didn't try to approach me or say anything, and I was fine with that. I didn't have the patience to hear more of her excuses. My head was spinning, my chest was heavy, but there was one clear thought cutting through the noise. I had to get my life back. I spent most of the day alone in my office. The ache of betrayal sat like a stone in my stomach, but it wasn't just about her anymore. The DNA results kept flashing in my mind, reminding me of what I'd lost, or maybe never truly had. Still, every time I heard the kids' voices, I felt a pang of guilt. They didn't deserve any of this. To me, they were still my children, and no amount of paper evidence would change the bond one had with them. That afternoon, I took the first real step forward. I called my lawyer, laying everything out piece by piece. The facts came out flat and cold, but the process of explaining it all helped me focus. My lawyer was calm, professional, and straight to the point, which was exactly what I needed. He told me to begin separating our finances immediately and to collect as much evidence as possible to support a divorce case. The goal wasn't just to leave, it was to make sure I left with my dignity and as much of my life intact as possible. The next call was to a private investigator. I wanted more than just the texts and recordings I'd found. I wanted the whole truth. I needed proof that couldn't be twisted or denied. The investigator promised to gather everything. Marcus's background, his connection to Hannah, their meetings, anything that could expose the full extent of their betrayal. Evenings were the hardest. Sitting with the kids, helping them with homework, reading to them before bed. It was the one part of my life that still felt normal. But even in those moments, I couldn't stop thinking about how much everything was going to change. I kept asking myself the same question. When the dust settled, would they still see me as their dad? Hannah, meanwhile, kept her distance. She stayed in our bedroom most of the time or left the house without saying where she was going. She didn't try to explain herself or ask for forgiveness. Not that I would have given her the chance. Her silence said more than her words ever could. By the end of the week, I had a plan. The lawyer and I went over every detail. The house, the business, custody. I made sure to move money into secure accounts, not out of spite but because I couldn't trust her anymore. Claire was a lifesaver during this time. She handled the office seamlessly, but more than that, she just listened. Her support reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. On Friday evening, the private investigator delivered the final blow. A thick report packed with everything I needed. Photos, records, receipts. It was all there. I flipped through the pages, reading about her hotel stays and her shared expenses with Marcus. She'd even used our joint account to fund her betrayal. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just emotional anymore. It was about protecting myself and what I'd built. That weekend, I worked quietly but methodically. The divorce filing was ironclad. It outlined everything: her infidelity, her financial misconduct, and my claim for custody. I wasn't going to let her lies cost me my children, no matter what the DNA said. I'd been the one raising them, loving them, and I wasn't going to let her reckless choices rip them away. By Sunday night, I felt ready. The pain was still there, it would be for a long time, but so was a sense of resolve. Confronting her had been like ripping the bandage off a deep wound, but now it was time to stitch things up and move forward. This wasn't just about escaping the mess she'd created. It was about taking control of my life again. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. By Monday morning, the house was buzzing with a false sense of normalcy. The kids were rushing around, getting ready for school, their laughter filling the air like it always did. Hannah busied herself in the kitchen, acting as though the past week hadn't torn our lives apart. It was almost impressive, the way she pretended everything was fine. But I saw through it. I dropped the kids off at school, exchanging the usual hugs and promises to see them later. Driving back home, I rehearsed the steps I needed to take next. Today was the day I'd hand her the divorce papers. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted her to know it was over. When I got home, she was sitting at the dining table with a mug of coffee, her phone in hand. She didn't look up when I walked in. Her avoidance had become routine, and I was more than fine with it. I went to my office and opened the envelope containing the papers. Seeing them again, my name, her name, the detailed accounts of her infidelity, brought a wave of anger, but I steadied myself. This wasn't about emotions anymore. This was about ending things cleanly and making sure she couldn't twist the story. Walking back to the dining room, I placed the envelope in front of her. Her eyes darted to it, and she froze. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she looked at me, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. For a moment, I thought she might try to argue, but she didn't. Slowly, she reached for the envelope, her hands trembling. As she read through the papers, her face went pale. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, letting her absorb it. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her flipping pages. Eventually, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I could see the words forming in her mind, the excuses and justifications she was about to spill. But I didn't let her speak. "This isn't a discussion," I said, my tone flat. "This is what's happening. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." For the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. She started shaking her head, tears spilling over. She tried to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, but I didn't care. I left her there and walked back to my office. Closing the door behind me, I exhaled deeply. It felt like a small victory, handing her those papers, but it was just the beginning. Later that day, I received a call from the private investigator. The results of his latest digging were damning. Marcus's wife, Evelyn, had been suspicious for months. She had suspected the affair and had hired her own investigator. The pieces were falling into place faster than I could have anticipated. Evelyn's investigator had shared everything with her. Emails, photos, even recordings of Marcus and Hannah together. It was a goldmine of evidence, not just for my divorce case but for exposing the affair publicly. Evelyn reached out to me through the investigator, asking for a meeting. I agreed, curious to hear what she had to say. We met at a small cafe, away from prying eyes. She was composed but clearly furious. She laid out her own plan, one that aligned perfectly with mine. Evelyn didn't just want to end her marriage. She wanted Marcus to face the consequences of his actions. She wanted the world to know what kind of man he was. I couldn't help but admire her determination. Together, we agreed to share our findings with a journalist she trusted. The story wouldn't just expose Marcus and Hannah, it would ensure they couldn't hide behind lies any longer. When I got home that evening, Hannah was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The papers were still on the dining table, untouched since the morning. She didn't acknowledge me when I walked in, and I didn't acknowledge her either. Upstairs, I went through my nightly routine with the kids. They didn't sense anything out of the ordinary, and I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. As I tucked them into bed, I promised myself that no matter what happened, they would always come first. Downstairs, Hannah was gone. The papers were still there, unsigned. I didn't know where she had gone, and I didn't care. My focus was on the future, one without her lies, her betrayal, or the damage she had caused. The unraveling had begun, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I awoke to a house that felt strangely quiet. Hannah wasn't in the bedroom or the kitchen. The kids were still asleep, their peaceful breathing a reminder of what I needed to protect. A glance at the dining table confirmed she still hadn't signed the papers. Instead, they lay untouched, as if she believed ignoring them would make them disappear. By mid-morning, she returned. Her expression was tight, her eyes puffy. She avoided looking at me as she slipped upstairs, her purse clutched tightly to her chest. I didn't ask where she'd been. It didn't matter. I spent the day finalizing the next step in my plan. Evelyn had called, letting me know that the journalist was eager to meet. We agreed to send over the compiled evidence first, laying out the timeline of the affair, the financial misconduct, and the blatant betrayal. Evelyn seemed as resolute as I was, her anger burning as hot as mine. The journalist was cautious but interested. The emails, text messages, and photos spoke volumes. The additional detail from Evelyn about Marcus's misuse of company funds to cover up the affair turned it from a scandal into a potential career-ending catastrophe for him. By the time I finished the call, I could feel the pieces falling into place. That evening, Hannah approached me for the first time since I handed her the divorce papers. She sat across from me at the dining table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, and her voice wavered as she asked if we could talk. I didn't interrupt as she began to speak, her words coming out in a flood. She apologized, again, but it felt hollow. She talked about regret, about wanting to fix things, about how she never meant for any of this to happen. She pleaded with me to think of the children, to consider giving her another chance. I listened without saying a word. When she finished, her eyes searched mine for any sign of forgiveness, any hint that I might waver. But there was nothing left to give. Calmly, I reminded her of what she had done, not just to me, but to the life we had built together. I told her that trust was the foundation of any relationship, and she had shattered it beyond repair. I pointed to the divorce papers, still sitting untouched. My voice was steady as I made it clear. This was the only path forward. Her tears began again, but I didn't let them sway me. She asked if I could think about it, if we could try counseling. I shook my head. She wasn't crying for me or for the damage she had caused. She was crying because her lies were no longer working, and the consequences were catching up to her. The final blow came later that night. The journalist reached out with a draft of the story they planned to publish. It was brutal, exposing not just the affair but the misuse of company funds, the cover-ups, and the impact on both families. Evelyn and I had agreed to keep our children out of it. The focus would remain on Marcus and Hannah. I stared at the draft for a long time before responding with my approval. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about closure. Letting the truth out into the open was the only way I could move forward. The story hit the following morning, and the fallout was immediate. Marcus was removed from his position at work, his reputation in shambles. Calls and texts flooded my phone from mutual acquaintances, family members, even colleagues. Everyone had seen the article, and everyone had questions. Hannah was hysterical. She blamed me for ruining her life, for airing our dirty laundry in public. She screamed about how the kids would hear about it someday, how I was destroying everything we had built. I let her rant until she was hoarse, then reminded her that she had done this to herself. Over the next few days, the house became a war zone. Hannah's anger shifted between fury and desperation. She alternated between begging me to reconsider and accusing me of being heartless. But I stayed focused, refusing to let her manipulate me any longer. The final straw came when Evelyn called to tell me that Marcus had tried to contact her, begging for forgiveness and asking to see their children. She laughed bitterly, telling me she'd already filed for divorce and had no intention of giving him another chance. Her strength inspired me. That night, I made the decision to move forward with full custody. It wasn't just about Hannah's betrayal anymore. It was about the stability and future of the kids. They didn't need to grow up in a house filled with tension and deceit. The next morning, I handed Hannah a revised custody agreement. Her face crumpled as she read it, but I didn't flinch. This was for the best, even if she couldn't see it. As the days passed, the house began to feel lighter. The kids were oblivious to the chaos unfolding around them, and I made sure it stayed that way. I focused on them, on work, on building the next chapter of my life. Hannah finally signed the divorce papers a week later, her defiance replaced by quiet resignation. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. The storm had broken, leaving wreckage in its wake. But for the first time in months, I could see a glimmer of sunlight breaking through the clouds. With the divorce papers signed, the first phase of this nightmare came to an end. The next steps would be legal formalities, court filings, custody agreements, and financial settlements. But the hardest part was behind me. Hannah's defeat was written all over her face when she handed over the documents. Her fire, The defiance that once defined her seemed extinguished. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or something closer to pity. The kids remained blissfully unaware of the depth of what was happening. I kept things as normal as possible, sticking to routines like movie nights, helping with homework, and their weekly soccer practices. They were my anchor, the reason I stayed steady while everything else crumbled. Hannah, on the other hand, became almost invisible. She rarely came out of her room, and when she did, she avoided me completely. I caught glimpses of her now and then, her expression a mixture of guilt and bitterness. She'd lost her control over the narrative, and it was clear she didn't know how to handle it. Meanwhile, the fallout from the article continued. Marcus's firing became public knowledge, and his wife, Evelyn, was making her own moves to dismantle their marriage. Mutual acquaintances started to distance themselves from Hannah and Marcus. A few even reached out to me, expressing disbelief over what had happened. I kept my responses polite but brief. The last thing I wanted was to turn my life into gossip fodder. In the midst of the chaos, Claire became an even more significant presence in my life. She kept the office running smoothly while I dealt with lawyers and investigators, but her support went beyond the professional. She checked in on me often, offering quiet encouragement and a listening ear. There was no judgment in her words, no pity, just genuine kindness. One afternoon, after the kids were dropped off at a friend's house, I sat in my office, staring at the divorce filing. The legal jargon outlined every failure of my marriage in stark black and white. It felt surreal to see something that once brought me so much joy reduced to a sterile document. Claire knocked gently before stepping inside. She set a cup of coffee on my desk and sat across from me without a word. "You don't have to babysit me, you know," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. She smiled faintly. "I'm not. But I know you well enough to see when you're carrying too much." Her words lingered as I glanced at the papers again. Claire's presence had been a quiet constant through all of this, and I couldn't help but appreciate how much she had stepped up when I needed it most. As the weeks passed, I focused on rebuilding. The private investigator's work was done, the article had run its course, and the initial shock was starting to wear off. My lawyer assured me the divorce would be finalized smoothly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence on my side. Hannah's behavior shifted during this time. She became subdued, almost submissive. Her interactions with the kids were strained, as if she didn't know how to connect with them anymore. I wondered if she felt the weight of what she had done or if her actions were just part of her survival strategy. Either way, I didn't let it sway me. One evening, as I sat in the living room scrolling through emails, I received a message from Evelyn. She wanted to thank me for my cooperation and let me know that her divorce proceedings were well underway. She also mentioned how much lighter her life felt without Marcus's toxicity weighing her down. Her words resonated with me. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace. The life I had built with Hannah was gone, but maybe that wasn't the tragedy I had once thought it was. Eventually, the kids started to notice changes. Lily, my oldest, asked why I had been sleeping in the guest room so often. I told her the truth, in a way that an 8-year-old could understand. That Mommy and Daddy were going through something difficult, but that we both loved her and her brother more than anything. She seemed satisfied with that answer, but I could see the questions lingering in her eyes. As for Luke, my youngest, he was too young to grasp the complexities. His world revolved around bedtime stories, dinosaurs, and Saturday morning pancakes. I envied his simplicity, his ability to find joy in the little things. Hannah's presence in the house became more sporadic. She stayed out late some nights, and though she never said where she went, I had my suspicions. I didn't ask. Her life was no longer my concern. The turning point came when I received the official date for our divorce hearing. It felt like both an ending and a beginning, a chance to finally close this chapter and start over. As I looked around the house, I realized how much of it still held traces of her. The photos on the walls, the decorations she had chosen, even the way the furniture was arranged, it all reminded me of the life we had shared. Slowly, I began to change things. I took down the pictures, rearranged the living room, and even painted the walls. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Through it all, Claire remained a constant presence. Her quiet support became something I leaned on more than I expected. There were moments when I caught myself wondering if there could be something more between us, but I pushed those thoughts aside. It was too soon, and I wasn't ready to open my heart again. Not yet. For now, my focus was on healing, on rebuilding my life and giving my kids the stability they deserved. The wreckage Hannah had left behind was still there, but piece by piece, I was clearing it away. The weeks leading up to the divorce hearing felt like the calm after a storm. There was still debris to sift through, but the chaos had quieted. Hannah kept to herself, moving around the house like a ghost. She spent more nights away, her absence almost more present than when she was here. I stopped wondering where she went. It wasn't my problem anymore. The kids, thankfully, remained my anchor. Lily was sharp for her age, picking up on the tension without fully understanding its source. She asked fewer questions as time passed, sensing that the answers might not be what she wanted to hear. Luke, still innocent in his young age, stayed blissfully unaware. His days were filled with crayons, toy cars, and laughter, and I clung to that lightness like a lifeline. The hearing day arrived without much fanfare. I had envisioned it as a momentous occasion, something dramatic, but instead, it was clinical, emotionless. My lawyer presented our case with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Hannah didn't argue. She signed where she was told, barely meeting my eyes. When the judge finalized the proceedings, I felt an unexpected weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. 12 years of marriage reduced to a stack of papers and signatures. There was no joy in it, but there was relief, a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. Back at the house, I spent the afternoon clearing out the last remnants of our shared life. Her belongings were packed into boxes, left in the garage for her to collect. The empty spaces they left behind felt like a blank canvas, an opportunity to rebuild. Claire stopped by that evening, unannounced. She said she wanted to check on me, but I suspected she knew the significance of the day. She brought takeout from my favorite Thai place and sat with me in the living room, her presence steady and comforting. We talked about work, the kids, anything but the divorce. She didn't press me to share how I felt, and for that, I was grateful. Her quiet understanding made the silence between our words feel meaningful rather than empty. As the days turned into weeks, I began to adjust to life without Hannah. The changes were small at first, new routines with the kids, rearranging furniture, buying things that felt like mine rather than ours. The house started to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home again. One Saturday, Lily asked if we could plant a garden in the backyard. She said she wanted something beautiful to grow, something we could take care of together. It was such a simple request, but it felt profound. We spent the day digging in the dirt, planting flowers and vegetables, and by the time we were done, I realized she had given me more than just a garden. She had given me a reminder that life moves on, that new things can grow even after the harshest winters. Hannah's visits with the kids became sporadic. She didn't seem to know how to connect with them anymore, and they didn't seek her out the way they once had. When she did come by, I kept our interactions brief and cordial. The anger I once felt had dulled into something quieter, a kind of pity, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. Meanwhile, Claire continued to be a steady presence in my life. She never overstepped, never pushed for more, but her support was always there when I needed it. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, I found myself sharing more with her than I had intended. I told her about the DNA tests, about the betrayal, about the fear that I wasn't enough for the kids now that the truth was out. She listened without judgment, her eyes soft with understanding. When I finished, she simply said, "You've always been enough for them, Daniel. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Her words stayed with me, planting a seed of hope I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, as I sat in the garden with the kids, watching the flowers Lily had planted begin to bloom, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The chaos and pain of the past months hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. The kids laughed as they chased each other around the yard, their joy infectious. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we were going to be okay. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for now, I was content to take it one step at a time. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had the power to dictate my future. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was steady, and after the chaos of the past months, steady felt like a gift. The mornings were filled with the kids' laughter and the usual chaos of getting them ready for school. Evenings were quieter, spent reading, cooking simple meals, or helping Lily and Luke with their homework. The garden Lily and I had planted became a surprising source of comfort. It was a small patch of life amidst everything that had felt lifeless for so long. Watching it grow reminded me that, despite everything, new things could still flourish. Hannah's presence in our lives continued to fade. Her visits became less frequent, and when she did come, they were awkward and brief. The kids stopped asking when they'd see her next, and I stopped offering excuses. I knew her choices would have lasting effects on them, but I resolved to be the constant they needed. Claire's role in my life also shifted. She remained the rock I leaned on, but there was something unspoken between us now, an understanding that our connection was deepening. She never pushed, and I didn't either. It wasn't the time, but knowing she was there gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. One Friday evening, as I sat in my office finishing some paperwork, I received an email from Evelyn. It was short but meaningful. She thanked me for standing with her and for helping expose the truth. She mentioned that her divorce was finalized and that she and her children were moving to a new city for a fresh start. Her message struck a chord with me. Evelyn had taken the step I hadn't yet, leaving the remnants of her old life behind to build something entirely new. Her courage made me think about what I wanted for myself and my kids. That weekend, I made a decision. I spent Saturdays sorting through the house, packing away old memories that no longer served us. Photos of Hannah and me went into boxes, along with other reminders of the life we'd shared. It wasn't out of anger or bitterness. It was about making space for something new. The kids noticed the changes but didn't seem upset. In fact, Lily offered to help. She picked out new picture frames for the living room, filling them with photos of just the three of us. Her quiet determination to create a happy home left me both proud and humbled. As the weeks passed, I started to feel more like myself again. Work was going well, the kids were thriving, and the house began to feel less like a place of loss and more like a home. One evening, Claire stopped by with dinner, as she often did. We ate in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing. When the kids went to bed, she lingered, helping me clean up. There was a moment, a quiet pause, where I felt the weight of her presence in a way I hadn't before. She caught me staring and smiled, her cheeks coloring slightly. "What?" she asked, her tone light but curious. I shook my head, a small smile forming. "Nothing. Just, thank you. For everything." She didn't press further, but her eyes softened, and I knew she understood. As Claire left that night, I stood at the door, watching her walk to her car. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about what life might look like with her in it. Not as a coworker or a friend, but as something more. I wasn't ready yet, and I knew she wouldn't rush me. But the possibility of a future with her felt less like a dream and more like a path I could eventually walk. For now, though, my focus remained on my kids and the life we were rebuilding together. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. Piece by piece, I was finding my way back to the person I wanted to be, and that was enough. Months passed, and the wounds left by Hannah's betrayal slowly began to heal. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, moments where the weight of everything caught up to me, but those moments grew fewer. The house felt lighter, the laughter of my kids filling the spaces where silence and tension had once lingered. The garden Lily and I had planted flourished, a vibrant patch of color and life. It became a family project, with Luke eagerly taking on the role of chief waterer, and Lily adding her artistic touches with handmade markers for each plant. Watching them work together, I felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. They had been through so much, yet their resilience shone brighter than ever. Hannah drifted further from our lives. Her visits with the kids became rare, and when she did come, they felt more like an obligation than a genuine effort to reconnect. The kids stopped asking about her entirely. Part of me wanted to resent her for that, for her inability to step up as a mother, but I couldn't waste my energy on her anymore. My focus was on giving Lily and Luke the love and stability they needed. Work became a refuge again. The chaos of the past months had settled, and with Claire's help, my company not only stabilized but began to grow. She had an uncanny way of keeping things running smoothly, even when I felt like I was barely holding it together. Claire herself had become more than just a support system. There was an ease between us now, an unspoken understanding that we were both navigating something new. She never pressed me to move faster than I was ready, but her presence was a constant reminder that life could still hold something good. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching the kids play, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. She mentioned that she'd been offered a position at another firm, a big opportunity that would take her out of town. Her words hit me harder than I expected. The idea of her not being part of my daily life felt like losing a lifeline. But I knew I couldn't ask her to stay, not unless I was ready to offer her more than gratitude. Instead, I congratulated her, masking the ache I felt. She smiled, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, as though she understood the conflict I didn't voice. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the living room, turning her words over in my mind. The thought of losing her made something clear that I had been avoiding. I wanted her in my life, not just as a friend or a colleague, but as something more. The next day, I asked her to join me for coffee after work. She agreed, her curiosity evident in the way she studied me. Sitting across from her in that small cafe, I told her the truth. I told her how much her support had meant to me, how she had been my anchor when everything else fell apart. And I told her I didn't want her to leave, not because of work, but because I wanted to see where this could go. Claire listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest feel lighter. She told me she had been waiting for me to figure that out on my own, and that she wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't a grand, romantic moment, but it didn't need to be. It was honest, and that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Claire became a bigger part of my life. She didn't try to replace Hannah in the kids' lives. She respected their boundaries and let them set the pace. But they warmed to her quickly, drawn to her kindness and patience. By the time a year had passed since the divorce, the scars of the past had faded into memories. The house had transformed, filled with new furniture, new photos, and new routines. The garden had grown into a vibrant testament to resilience, and so had we. One evening, as we sat on the patio watching the sunset, Claire reached for my hand. The kids were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing around us. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The betrayal and pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. My life was no longer about what I had lost. It was about what I had rebuilt. This was a new chapter, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it fully.